Hi everyone, my name is Mostafa Elhefnawy and I head the product team at SnapTravel. Today I will be speaking to you guys about user research for product managers. Based on my experience from working with many product managers at multiple different startups over my career, I found that most PMs are knowledgeable about interviews and surveys, but lack a deep understanding of what other methodologies exist out there, when to use them, how to properly structure their user research. So today I'm going to try to tackle some of those and shed some light there. User research is really one of the most critical parts of the whole product development lifecycle. It's the single most link that helps you empathize with your users and their list of wants and needs, which serves really as a basis for your product. So today's agenda will look something like this. First, kind of give blanket definition about what user research is, and afterwards really helping you understand how to structure your user research. So first I'll be talking about objectives, how to define some of your objectives, how to define your hypothesis, what type of research methodologies exist, and how do you decide which ones to use and when. Conducting the actual user research, and then also at the very end is more synthesizing all the data and insights that you get out of it so that then you can use it for your team and make it actionable. So to start off, there's obviously a multitude of different definitions for what user research is. But the one I like is really user research focuses on understanding user behaviors, needs, and motivations through observational techniques, task analysis, and other feedback methodologies. UX practitioners have borrowed a lot of those techniques from academics, scientists, market researchers, and others. However, there's still a decent amount of research that is fairly unique to the UX world. Something to understand is that really the main goal of design research is to inform the design process from the perspective of the end user. It is research that really prevents us from designing for one user, ourselves. It's fairly well accepted that the purposes of UX and user-centered design are to design with the end user in mind, and it's research really that tells us who that person is, in what context they'll use this product or service, and what do they need from us. So I think one of the first things that you really have to understand is what's your objectives? What are you trying to find out? Objective for user research may vary depending on the stage life cycle of the product. Kind of the objective in early life cycle, in the stage of like ideation stage, you're really there to kind of try to explore new directions and opportunities you can take the product. Versus when you're on the execution stage, you're there to the user research style or methodologies, your objective there is different because you're trying to probably inform some of the designs that you want to do or optimize some of the designs to be able to reduce some of the risk and usability of your products, right? And then in the more of an assessment phase, you're really trying to measure your product performance against itself or its competitors and trying to kind of improve it based on that. So it's a little bit more of an incremental improvement. So really, for a product that's still in the ideation phase, you want to identify unarticulated user needs that you would want to solve. However, your goal might also be to validate a prototype, MVP, or simply test out a specific feature. Products also come in kind of like different stages. One of the ways that you could think about it is kind of from a 0 to 1 stage, and then 1 to N. Which is pretty similar to ideation versus execution versus assessment. Maybe if I go to the next slide, kind of to explain to you guys a little bit better about, here's an example of ideation and assessment phase. So in the case over here, you see this is more from this part Like there's that famous quote by Henry Ford, which tells you, I don't know if it's true or not, to be honest, because I hear a lot of quotes and sometimes they're they're fake, but I think it rings true. That quote says, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And this is kind of very true in this phase. For you to be able to go from kind of having a cart with a horse to a car, the type of user research methodologies that you'd use are a little bit different than you would need from going from a car to a pickup truck. It's more of a kind of an incremental improvement versus this one is a drastic improvement compared to the normal kind of product, right? So because of that, you really want to think about what type of user research methods that you want to do, or what's your objective in that case. So in this case, really the the ideation phase is more from this, going from a cart with a horse to a car. But then from the assessment phase, so once you have the car and you say, okay, people have different use cases for cars. People might need pickup trucks to be able to put some of their equipment, or maybe put other stuff in it that doesn't necessarily fit into a normal car. And then so you kind of tweak a little bit of the design of the car to look something like this. But essentially, it's very, very similar product between the car and a pickup truck. So, and then another example of the execution phase is when you're trying to also, keeping it in the same realm of the cars, when you're trying to kind of build the steering wheel. Over here, one of the things you could do is you try to understand which type of kind of, like, how do you build the steering wheel? Like, how many buttons does it need to have? Does it need to be complicated this much, or can you just go along with what you have over here? Does it need to be in this? Do you need all these buttons? Do you need it to be as complicated as this is? And that's kind of where, when you're actually executing and building for that car, these are some of you need different research methods to help you make those design decisions and product decisions about how does the steering wheel in the car look like. So the next thing is you really need to figure out, you need to come up with a hypothesis. And one of the core things to good user research is having a hypothesis. A good hypothesis is important because it leads to good experimental design. And a good experimental design is important because you need it to properly validate or invalidate what you're doing. And I think it's a good thing to really start with a broaden kind of like the opportunity space that you have, and then narrow down to a set of specific hypotheses you want to investigate, validate, or refute. One good template to structure your hypothesis in is what you see in front of you, kind of framing it in, we believe so-and-so will do X, Y, and Z because ABC. And really, you're trying to understand, I think that when you lay it out that way, it really helps kind of put it into more concrete terms. So an example would be, hey, we believe business travelers will sign up for our loyalty program because they care about travel points so that they can use them for their own travel. That could be like one hypothesis, and we need to then kind of try to do user research to be able to validate some of those hypotheses, right? So next up, what you need to think about is research methodologies. I think research methodologies really fall into one of two main buckets. There's the quantitative research, and there's the qualitative research. Quantitative research is any research that can be measured numerically. It answers questions such as how many people clicked here, or what percentage of users are able to find the call to action. It's valuable to understand statistical likelihoods of what is happening on a site or an app or whatever. Qualitative research is sometimes called soft research, and it really answers questions like, why didn't people see the call to action? and what else did people notice on that page. And often takes more form of interviews and conversations. Qualitative research really helps us understand why people do things that they do. I think the list you see in front of you is by no means all the research methodologies that exist. I just had to shortlist them so I don't end up talking for hours. Surveys and interviews are really one of the most used ones, but I wanted to really shed some more light into some of the other ones that some people might not know about, or not know how to even run them, and the different types of each one of those as well. So to start off, surveys, pretty kind of self-explanatory, but it's really a series of questions which gives you quantitative information from a large sample set. In order to really conduct a survey, a very important factor is determining your sample size. You can easily calculate the sample size using whatever online various calculators. I put a link over here for a survey calculator from SurveyMonkey. I think you need to kind of figure out what your population size is, your confidence interval and confidence level, and then that way it would be able to understand how many people do you need to answer your survey for you to be able to have statistically significant numbers. There's downsides to surveys and questionnaires though. You can't interact directly with the respondents, and therefore you can't help with interpreting some of the like the questions or framing them if the wording isn't quite perfect. So researchers typically have a limited ability to kind of do follow-up questions in this sense. Surveys see a far higher response rate when they don't require a login or contact information. And this anonymity makes it impossible to ask for clarification or further details. Next up is interviews. Interviews, again, one-on-one really discussions with users where the primary focus is on the hypothesis. It's really important to revolve your interview around these kind of 5 things. So the problem faced by the user, the frequency with which the user faces the problem, the last time the pain point occurred, what the user has done to solve the problem, and what the user liked or disliked about the solutions. Okay, now to the interesting types of user research. So the first one that I'll talk about today is contextual inquiry, and it's also called an ethnographic interview or ethnographic research. It involves observing what people do as they go about their days in their natural habitats. So in this sort of interview, the user shows you, the interviewer, how they accomplish certain tasks. Essentially immersing you as the interviewer in their work or home culture. This helps the researchers understand the gaps between what people actually do and what they say they do. It can also shed light on things that users do when they are feeling most comfortable. One example I have is when I was working at a company called HomeStars, I was building an app for contractors like plumbers or electricians or whatever it may be. And one of the things I wanted to do is improve that app so that they use it more often. And so I wanted to understand, how can I add more value to some of these contractors? And one of the things I did is actually I basically followed a contractor for a full day to see how they worked, and like following them on house calls and whatnot, and wanted to understand how they use the app throughout the whole day, where the context kind of comes in, so that then I can help build some of the features there. And one of the insights that I actually got out of it was that one of the electricians that I shadowed a lot used a kind of like the tape measure all the time. And I realized that we can build a feature for them that allows them to use their camera as a tape measure using the AR module in a lot of like the very new phones, and we built that feature, and it was wildly popular with specific set of contractors because it allowed them, okay, I don't actually need to have a tape measure with me. I can just use my phone to be able to measure things at a pretty accurate rate. Other example could be with Uber Eats. Like, let's say I'm a product manager at Uber Eats and I'm trying to improve the app for the drivers that are driving around and delivering the food. One of the things I could do is I could like literally sit down with one of those drivers in their car and follow them throughout the whole day, so that I better understand how they use the app, what type of things exist, what problems they run into that they might not see as problems, but I observe as problems. So these are kind of like a couple of examples. So think about it. How can you do it to your users? Obviously, this is tougher to get that commitment of following somebody for a full day or a half day or whatever it may be, but it could be very, very valuable for you. Next up is usability testing. And usability testing really involves asking potential or current users of a product or service to complete a set of tasks and then observing their behavior to figure out the usability of your product or service. This can be really done using a live version of your site or app, a prototype or a work in progress, or even clickable wireframes. Even though there are many variations and styles of usability testing, there's kind of like three main commonly used ones, and that one would be moderated, unmoderated, and guerrilla. So for moderated usability testing, these are the most traditional type of that test. They can happen in person or via screen share video. Whole usability test labs are usually actually set up for this to complete this one-way kind of mirroring for the stakeholders to observe, like the product managers or designers or whatever it may be, for them to conduct kind of like moderated usability tests. In a moderated usability test, unbiased facilitator essentially really talks to the user, reading tasks to them out loud and prompting the user to think out loud as that user kind of accomplishes those tasks. The facilitator's role is to act as a connection between the stakeholders and the user, phrasing questions to evaluate the effectiveness of a design and testing assumptions while helping the user really feel comfortable with the process. For unmoderated usability tests, sometimes they're known also as asynchronous research, and it's really conducted online usually at the user's convenience. And the tasks and instructions are usually given via video or recorded audio, and the user then clicks a button to begin, and the test and the recording of their screen and audio starts. Just like in the moderated tests, users are obviously encouraged to speak their thoughts out loud, even though there's no facilitator to ask follow-up questions. Unmoderated tests are available through a bunch of different online sites as well, like usertesting.com and a bunch of other ones, and could be significantly cheaper also than moderated tests. And then the last one is guerrilla testing. This is kind of a modern, lightweight take on traditional tests. Instead of renting a lab or whatnot, guerrilla research is really just typically done out in the community. Users are found at coffee shops or subway stations or whatever it may be, and asked to complete kind of a set of basic tasks in exchange for a few dollars or a coffee, or maybe just out of the goodness of their hearts, right? While guerrilla testing is really a great option, especially if you're on a budget, it is best used only for types of products that have a large user base. So if you have more of a niche product, you'll struggle to find reliable information from a random selection that you get from guerrilla testing. One of the good tools that I've used in the past for usability testing in general is lookback.io. I would definitely suggest looking into it and using it for that purpose. Focus groups. So next up is really focus groups. Focus groups were formalized as a kind of a social research technique back in the 70s by this American sociologist Robert Merton. And they're really a qualitative research technique in which small groups of people are asked to discuss their opinions, ideas, thoughts, perceptions of a specific product or service, right? And the discussion topics are usually predetermined and moderated by a researcher who attempts to draw out and kind of balance viewpoints for each participant, right? There are many reasons, but there's kind of like many reasons why focus groups are not effective, but really one of the two main reasons is peer pressure is complex, right? People may try to give you answers to gain approval from others in the group. Again, this is obviously usually done like kind of often done unconsciously rather than deliberate. It could be a case of just following herd instinct. If everybody else in the group voices a particular opinion, then an individual is likely to fall in with that versus kind of disagreeing, right? It can also, or it can be kind of a case of trying to project an image that you would like others in the group expect you to have. Like, for example, if everybody says, hey, yeah, we love salads, would you kind of, who wants to be that person that says, no, I'd prefer chocolate instead, right? And then the second reason, one of the main reasons for focus groups not being as effective is lack of time. Typically, in a typical kind of like focus group, each participant may get to speak maybe 10 to 15 minutes on average. Given the huge complexity of factors that influence our behavior, many of which are kind of unconscious or difficult to articulate, it's unlikely that 10 minutes or 15 minutes would be enough to develop a good understanding of that individual's motivations. Next up is concept testing. So this is really a process of getting an idea evaluated by your target audience before it becomes available to the public. It includes really anything from product concepts to ad campaigns or whatever it may be. You could use it for logos, like if you want to change your logo and you want to get thoughts from your users or naming of new products or packaging or even messaging. This could be really, really helpful. It can help you get others in your company also behind your ideas. Do you ever kind of like have ideas that people are not kind of confident that they'll work? It's much easier proving that idea is popular with consumers that then convince your team to pursue it, right? So after all, really, if consumers are in your target market like it, who says it won't work, right? Next up is diary and camera studies. So over here, this is really it's a concept where participants are provided with a digital camera, or they can use their smartphone and kind of a formatted diary, which then they use them to capture data like tasks, thoughts, emotions, types of medias these participants interact with, etc. Right? And it's really relatively inexpensive to carry out for a longer term study. It's easy to share visualized data gathered through it. Unfortunately, there's heavy reliance on the motivation of the participant to record and submit data. So you're probably gonna like bias, like if you use this type of methodology, you're biased towards the people that are actually willing to do this for you, which usually might be your best users, right? A diary study can really reveal some useful behavior and trend data, which can be then further analyzed during a follow-up interview and whatnot. If you guys have ever heard of those university studies from the likes of Harvard and whatnot that go on for years, if not even decades sometimes, these studies usually incorporate diary and camera studies into them so that they're able to do them at scale. Next up is one of my favorites, is customer feedback, and this comes in a lot of different shapes and forms, but really it's open-ended or closed-ended kind of information that's provided by a sample of users where they usually self-select themselves. This could be something on the screen that says, hey, submit your feedback, or a button or a form or email or chat. There's multiple ways that you can submit this, but this is really one of the best feedback that I've ever usually gotten from users, because it's very raw feedback and usually it's very emotional for the user, whether they are pissed off about a specific thing or a feature or a bug. I've always caught a lot of bugs through these feedback kind of loops, and it really helps you understand the pain points that exist for the customers and see how those pain points change over time as well. One of my favorite tools I use for this is Hotjar, which allows me to just put kind of a feedback button, and that button also takes a screenshot of the screen that they're on to help also give me the context of what the user is seeing that is potentially upsetting them or making them happy as well. Next up is word choice. So word choice, there's kind of two different types of word choices. There's open word choice, which is really asking users to list 3 to 5 words that describe a specific design. And then there's closed word choice, which is also sometimes called desirability testing. And this really it's about providing users with a list of terms and asking them to pick the words which best describe the design. So they kind of pick from a finite list, versus open word choice is more from whatever they think about at the time. So for open word choice, it's slightly more structured approach to assessing kind of user perceptions. Is to ask really test participant to list several words that they have about the specific design. This format really helps ensure that you get at least some specific feedback while still keeping the question open-ended to discover factors you may not have considered, but are significant to your audience at the end of the day. You may get a wide range of descriptors back, so you'll need to probably do some analysis to properly kind of combine them into meaningful themes. A good approach for this analysis is to categorize terms as generally positive, negative, or neutral. And let me actually show it to you guys. So it would look something like this. And really, that when you're grouping the terms with the similar meanings, you evaluate whether they match your target attributes or not. For example, table below, the table really that you guys see shows descriptors provided about a business-to-business website whose brand goal is try to be trustworthy, contemporary, and helpful. And none of the terms were specifically named by the study participants as descriptors, but really you get to see that many users describe the design as simple, both as a positive thing and as a negative thing. And that's really interesting for you to understand and really try to dig in deeper there. And then for closed word choice, really requiring users to choose descriptors from a list of terms you provide is a controlled variation of that word choice method. And when you give the users a limited set of words, this method really focuses specifically on whether the target attributes are perceived by participants. So the brand traits that you hope to convey should probably be included in your list of terms, along with other choices which describe contradictory or divergent qualities that you don't want to have. That way, it's kind of less biased that way. Closed word choice is less sensitive than open word choice to discovering new points of view, but makes it easier to compare different versions of a design or the reactions of a different audience group to the same design. This technique really works well in an in-person study where you can really ask users follow-up questions and let them refer to the design as they explain the reasoning. For why kind of the selected term that they've used. It could also be used in a remote study, but really it's not a good idea to combine this with a 5-second test. 5-second tests are usually kind of tests where you show a design to somebody for just 5 seconds and then you don't show them anymore, and it gives you a better understanding. So you don't want to combine those like that type of tests where you just show the design for a small period of time and they no longer see the design. Instead, you want to do it more in a survey manner where the person can see the design in front of them, and then can proceed to choose the words from the list and then categorize them while they're looking at the design versus having to do it off of memory. This is just kind of like one of the main problems that I see when people run open word choices. Sometimes they combine them with these limited in time tests where somebody just looks at something and they have to go off of their memory. It's much better when they don't have to go off of their memory. Next thing is card sorting. So card sorting is really kind of like a quantitative or qualitative method that asks users to organize their items into groups. And you can assign categories to each of those groups. Card sorting comes in kind of like 3 different flavors. The first flavor is close card sorting. So for close card sorting, it looks something like this. In a close card sorting, you really create predefined categories, and then your participants will sort the cards into those categories. So participant must use the categories they already defined, and they shouldn't be able to create their own categories. A closed card sort is good for getting people to rank and prioritize items and actions, like from important to unimportant, or something I always use versus I never use. You can also use closed card sorting to test if your category labels make sense and which items they sort into those categories. The next one is open card sorting. So as the name probably hints, is really an open card sorting. The participants create their own categories by dragging cards into those groups and then making the most that make the most sense to them, right? So participants are really asked to label those groups into whatever categories they think makes the most sense. An open card sort can help you gain insight to help you understand the design, like to help you kind of design the initial information architecture of an application or a product. It could also help you understand how users naturally categorize the types of information that you have in your product and its relevance to them. It also helps you get user input into how to label your categories in your product. So this is usually really helpful for navigational items and whatnot. Like helps you understand where to put different parts of your application or group them together. And then the last one is a hybrid approach, and this is basically a hybrid of both of them. So in a hybrid approach, you really create predefined categories that you allow your users to put the whatever cards in them, but you also allow your users to create their own as well. It's a perfect mix between the both kind of open and closed, hence the name, obviously a hybrid. So running really a hybrid card sorting can allow you to get user input into potential category labels for your product, and to see if predefined labels that you have make sense to people as well. So you kind of hit 2 birds with 1 stone. Hybrid card sorting is especially useful if you have your information architecture partially complete. You're interested in kind of seeing how participants label and sort the rest of your structure. It's also useful if you think that allowing participants to create their own categories will mean less people abandon the study. So here's the card sorting exercise. I'm actually going to run you through a few different exercises. So this first one is about discovering motivators. And the question you would ask your participant here is, which features motivate you to shop more in an app? And you can see over here kind of like the features that you have. There's card sorting, flash sales, whatever it may be, and then the user can then basically structure it in a manner where they see the sorted cards top 3 choices, for example, right? So in this case, this is more about understanding and discovering the motivators for the user. This next one is about developing information architecture. So a question you would ask your user in this case is, how would you group these navigational items together? And this helps you understand kind of how people think about the navigational items or the information architecture in your application. So you would see something like this, where academics, you would have, okay, majors, minors, course schedules, tuition, financial, under tuition there would be financial assistance, scholarships. Under admissions there would be how to apply and the campus visits and stuff like that. Another example would be more goal alignment oriented. So over here, the question that you would ask your participant is, which of these school elements kind of are must-haves versus nice-to-haves? And this is basically like a parent that's trying to choose what's important, or like try to choose which school their child should go to. And if you're trying to understand, okay, if you have a school and you're trying to understand what are the most important features or elements of your school that parents care about when they're picking their child's school, this is really helpful, so that you can then over invest in a lot of the must-haves and the nice-to-haves, to invest less time and effort into them. Note on the setup of this, one thing I wanted to talk about is kind of like for this version, you can have the participants group them into must-haves and nice-to-haves. Images are also kind of like a good substitute for an activity like this. It's also interesting to note which cards the participant does not utilize, which can be just as revealing as the ones that they do choose. So I think that's a super interesting note. I only learned that after doing this exercise for years, but it's really, there's a lot of insight there for the cards that people don't use at all. And then the next example is emotional pairing. So the question here that we'd ask your user is, how do each kind of these brands make you feel? And you show them a list of brands and try to figure out how they would categorize some of the feelings. So over here, in this case, people feel angry or grossed out by McDonald's. There's Chipotle, people love it and maybe hate it or are mad at it. Panera Bread, people love that, or maybe neutral about it. Another note about really the setup here is this activity kind of pairs two sets of cards together. You'll need kind of an emotions set of cards depicted kind of by the emoji form that you see in front of you, and a set of brand cards. So in this case, the brand cards are the McDonald's or the Chipotle or the Panera. Logos should be more than enough. One thing you really need to make sure is you take enough notes for this activities, because some of the explanations will dive deep into the strengths, weaknesses, and areas for opportunity for each of those brands. So if you're trying to come up with a competitor to one of these brands, it's really helpful to really understand why they chose different types of emotions for different brands in this case. All right, just checking on time. Cool. The last one that I wanted to touch on today was A/B testing. So A/B testing, this is something I could go on for forever, but really A/B testing is another way of learning what actions users take. An A/B test is typically chosen as the appropriate research from when designers are struggling to choose between two competing elements. Whether the options are to two different styles of content, or a button, or a link, or two approaches to a homepage design, or an A/B test is usually required to randomly show each version to an equal number of users. It doesn't always have to be equal, but then reviewing kind of like the analytics on which version performed better, and trying to really dig in deeper on understanding why that was the case, and validate some of your hypothesis through that. A/B testing is particularly valuable when comparing a revised screen to an older screen, and when collecting data to prove kind of a specific assumption. So make sure to have hypothesis, success metrics, how long you'll run the A/B test for, have those ready and set in stone kind of before you run your experiment. For how long you run the A/B tests, you can use kind of similar calculators about trying to understand, okay, what is kind of like the degree of confidence that you want to have, and what are to be able to calculate kind of like the sample size that you would need. And then based on the sample size that you currently get, you'd be able to kind of calculate how many days or weeks it would take you to be able to get enough users to be able to have statistically significant data. If you're working at a company where an A/B test you run also costs your business a lot of dollars, so for me in e-commerce, a lot of tests that we run could potentially cost our business lost revenue. One thing that's really essential to do is have an error budget, which is basically the amount of money that you're willing to lose before shutting off an experiment before the end date. And this is super important, especially for riskier type of experiments that you want to run that could potentially impact your bottom line by a big amount. Going back to kind of the same product development phase, you really want to decide which methods to use. And I think that also still depends on which phase in the product development lifecycle you're in, right? So if you're in ideation, you could use kind of a mixture between qualitative and quantitative. You can do some of the diary camera studies that we talked about, surveys, interviews, focus groups, contextual inquiries. Those really help you kind of come up with insights for new directions or new products that you would want to tackle. If you're on the execution side of things, a lot of times it's really very qualitative type of research. So doing things like cart sorting. So let's say, for example, you're building the app already. You know you need to build X app, but in the app while you're building it, you want to figure out, okay, how do you want to structure the navigation? So you could definitely use the cart sorting exercise to be able to do that. And then you could use concept testing. Let's say you want to come up with a brand name or a name for the product or whatever it may be. You can use concept testing for that. You could use usability testing to understand, are you guys using accordions or instead of drop downs or this or that, like trying to understand when to use different types of design elements and word choice there. So and then for the last phase, which is more about assessing and really measuring your product performance against previous versions of itself or the competition, a lot of it is really driven by quantitative. So usability tests over here is key. Benchmarking, trying to understand possibly it could be like how fast your application is compared to your competitors or your old competitor or your old version of yourself. A/B testing is huge here. To be able to really understand different like small increments that you would do in your product and how that impacts your product overall. Does changing the color of your CTA incrementally increase potential conversion for that specific thing or call out or whatever it may be. Customer feedback also is super essential here. This is also to kind of give you like that same example that I gave about the cars, like that probably could have been something that came from customer feedback about, hey, yeah, I love this car, this is amazing, but I can't fit so and so in it. I wish I had something that looks like X, Y, and Z or whatever it may be. That would be very helpful. So I think kind of like framing your thinking around that will be very, very crucial. Another way that you could use to also decide which methods to use is to use a diagram like this. So, and this helps explain kind of like what people, the y-axis here is what people do and what people say, which is usually different. And the x-axis is more about how many and how much versus why and how to fix. And the different types of kind of methodologies fall under different areas here. So for example, A/B testing this is exactly what people would do, and it gives you a measure of like exactly how much and how many people converted for X, Y, and Z, how much did the conversion go up or down, stuff like that, versus more of like card sorting. This is really what people would say. So it's more of kind of like a qualitative aspect to it. So looking at it from both of those different perspectives, I think will be helpful for you. And then kind of like the second to last thing is really conducting the actual user research. So you really need to create kind of a facilitator cheat sheet, which would provide you more of like an outline of the goal of the research, the framework for findings, and the key questions that you're trying to answer. While conducting user research, you should kind of ask open-ended questions. Opening questions are questions that allow somebody to give a free-form answer. Closed-ended questions can be answered with a yes or no, or via limited kind of set of possible answers, so like multiple choice. Closed-ended questions are good for surveys because you get higher response rates because users don't have to type much. These closed-ended answers can easily be analyzed statistically as well. In a one-to-one usability testing setting, though, you want to get kind of a richer data than what's provided from just a simple yes or no questions. So if you test with 5 users, for example, it's not insightful to report that I don't know, let's say 60% of users said no to certain questions. If you can get users to talk in depth about a question, you can derive valid information from 5. You can really derive valid information from 5 users. Not statistical insights, but qualitative insights. So these are kind of examples of what closed-ended questions and open-ended questions look like. So over here you see kind of closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions could be something like, are you satisfied? Did it act as you expected? Do you think you would use this? Open-ended questions are, how satisfied are you or dissatisfied are you with the process? Or how would this fit into your work? Kind of really more open-ended questions. A little bit self-explanatory. And then last but not least, synthesizing your kind of research data. So really you need to convert raw notes to kind of bite-sized findings, create a summary sheet for each of the participants so you can easily revisit the results. I think one of the things you need to for sure do is refine your data so you can kind of for you to be able to refine your data, you could use something like Affinity Mapping. Affinity Mapping diagram is used to mainly just organize your data and ideas and findings into groups. Each item is written like on a sticky note, such as Post-its or whatever, or you could do it on a virtual one. And these ones are like notes that are then sorted into specific categories. I'll show you an example in just a sec. So steps involved in conducting affinity mapping, one is you would really write the data points gathered doing a specific research on sticky notes. So those could be specific insights that you get out of it. And then start placing those sticky notes on a wall or a whiteboard. And then later on, you would want to group those sticky notes with data points that have similar themes, right? And then after all the notes have been placed, you can see the kind of like the different categories formed by the data points. So here's an example that kind of helps put it more into perspective. Let's say a team needs to explore why few businesses struggle with sales, and an affinity mapping diagram would help you organize this something like this, right? So you could see, okay, it could be ineffective at promotions or limited area coverage by salesmen or limited products or whatnot. And then when you try to then categorize these, you see, okay, actually the things that are related to marketing are ineffective promotions, limited product reach, prices too low. So maybe marketing can do something here to improve. The ones that are related to sales that the sales team can help improve is the area of coverage or the motivation of the salespeople or the performance being tracked. So it really, really helps you understand how to tackle different sections of your feedback, or kind of understand even which parts has the most amount of insights, so that then you can prioritize that possibly as the highest. You could also use a spreadsheet or a Trello to organize your ideas. So this is kind of like what an Affinity Mapping Trello would look like. Probably easier than doing Post-it notes, because it lives digitally and people can see it easily. But yeah, this is kind of how Affinity diagram would look like on a Trello board. Okay. And then I think once you've kind of processed the data, it's time to really dwell deeper into the user insights about the needs. So one of the things you could do is try to understand how important is the need for the user, and how satisfied is the user with the current solution. And that really helps you understand the priorities. Obviously, there's different ways that you can prioritize this. This is just one of the ways. But really, you want to be in the sweet spot where the importance is very high and the users are not currently satisfied with existing solutions, whether that solution is from you or from a competitor or from nobody at all, maybe because that solution doesn't exist. And then documentation, really that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. Documentation is super crucial. Two things I really wanted to say is document your findings in a central place. This could be anywhere. Just try to figure out some form of documentation that you could do. You could do it in Google Docs, you can do it in, Google Drive, or you could do it on Confluence, or you could use whatever you want as long as it works for your team, right? And then also sharing the insights with PMs, engineers, stakeholders, sharing it with the right people so that they kind of get to empathize better with your users and make better decisions in the future as they build the products for your users. I want to show you an example of this is kind of like a GIF. I'll let it load, but this is how we document our user research insights. So this is actually a template that shows the experiment owner, start date, end date. So this is more for our A/B tests that we had. You can see over here the hypothesis, error budget, whatnot. And then over here we also have active experiments that exist ready for analysis, concluded experiments, and then this is kind of like a centralized place where people can come in and see some of the experiments that we ran and how they performed. They could look at it. They can even look at the data and kind of dig in deeper if they wanted to after the fact as well. So it really helps provide that documentation there, so that if somebody else, let's say, joins the company later on and has some things that they want to experiment, you can tell them, hey, we already experimented and here's what it looked like and here's what the data told us. And that's really it. Thanks a lot. I know, I think we've passed about an hour and 5 minutes, so I hope this presentation sheds some light on how to properly structure your user research, what type of different user research methodologies are at your disposal, and how you can also synthesize the results of your user research to allow you and your team to build better products. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.